Okay, so let's talk about modal interchange. Now, modal interchange is used to create more color in your chord progression, or to make your chord progression a little bit more interesting. Now, lots of jazz standards use modal interchange. It's a very, very common device employed in jazz. But before I talk about modal interchange, allow me to digress quickly and talk about tonicization. So I've got a separate video on secondary dominance and tonicization, and in it I distinguish between modulation, which is changing key for a long period of time, and tonicization, which is changing key for a short period of time by using a dominant chord. Like, for example, a 1, 6, 2, 5, 1 chord progression. Now, the 6 in this case is an A dominant 7 chord, which isn't in the key of C major. But this is not technically modulation because the chord only lasts for half a bar before going to the D minor 7, which is in the key of C major. So rather than modulating, this chord tonicizes the D minor 7 before going back into the key of C major and finishing back on the C major 7 chord, back on the root note. Now, it's useful to make a similar differentiation between modulation and modal interchange. So modulation is still changing key for a long period of time, whereas modal interchange is changing key or using chords from another key for a short period of time while retaining the same tonal center. And by tonal center, I mean retaining the same root note. Now, what a long period of time compared to a short period of time means is subjective, and I'll give an example that explains this later in this video. Now, it's also worth quickly explaining the difference between a relative key and a parallel key. Now, relative keys are two keys that have the same notes but a different root note, like C major and A natural minor. And a parallel key are two keys that have different notes but the same root note, like C major and C natural minor. And essentially, in modal interchange, you borrow a chord from a parallel key, that is, a key with the same root note. And this is why using modal interchange is also called using borrowed chords. So you can borrow chords from other keys or modes, and as long as the chord progression is still leading towards the ultimate tonic chord, it won't sound like you've completely changed keys. It won't sound like you've modulated. Now, up here in the picture-in-picture, I've written up all the modes of the major scale where C is the root note, as well as the C melodic and C harmonic minor scales, and all their associated chords. For example, C mixolydian or F major has a B flat, so the associated chords use all white notes except for B flat. So we have C7, D minor 7, E minor 7 flat 5, F major 7, and so on. Right? All the chords in the key of F major. And so notice that all these scales have the same root note, C, so they are all parallel. This means you can borrow any chord from any of these keys. So let's take a 2-5-1 in the key of C major and borrow the 2-5 from other modes or keys. So a 2-5-1 in C is D minor 7 to G7 to C major 7, and it sounds like this. Now, you can borrow the 2-5 from the harmonic minor scale and have a D minor 7 flat 5 to G7 flat 9 to C major 7, and then it'll sound like this. Right, it sounds more interesting and colourful than a standard major 2-5, but it still sounds like we're moving towards the ultimate tonic chord. It still sounds like we're moving towards C or C major 7. Similarly, you can borrow the 2-5 from the Aeolian mode and have D minor 7 flat 5 to G minor 7 to C major 7. Now again, that sounds a bit more interesting than the regular 2-5, and it still sounds like we're moving towards that ultimate tonic chord in the C major 7. But it doesn't quite sound as strong because we're using a G minor 7 rather than a G dominant 7, so the pull towards the tonic chord isn't quite as strong, but it's still perfectly acceptable as a modal interchange. Similarly, you can borrow the 2-5 from the Phrygian mode and get D flat major 7 to G minor 7 flat 5 to C major 7. Right, so that sounds a little bit more interesting than the standard 2-5, but it still sounds like we're moving towards the ultimate tonic chord, towards the C. Or again, you can borrow the 2-5 from the Lydian mode and have a D7 to G major 7 to C major 7. Right, so all of those are plausible modal interchanges. I borrowed the 2-5s from a parallel key or mode. And all of these work as modal interchanges because the tonal center stays the same. That is, C still sounds like the tonal center. The C major chord still sounds like the tonic chord. However, some borrowed chords work better than others, and thus are used more often than others. Remember that the definition of modal interchange is using chords from a different key while still retaining the same tonal center. Now, the Lydian mode modal interchange has a D7 moving to the G major 7. Now this creates a 5-1 perfect cadence, which makes it sound like the tonal center is G. Right? That's the nature of a 5-1 chord progression. That's how tonicization works. But we want C to sound like the tonal center. So this particular modal interchange, that is the Lydian 2-5 modal interchange, doesn't work very well. You could argue that that in fact is not modal interchange, but instead that we modulated to the key of G major for 2 bars. And again, that's because it sounds like the tonal center has moved and become G. Whereas the harmonic minor 2-5 modal interchange works really well because it still keeps C as the tonal center because of that altered G7 chord, which sounds like it's still pulling towards C as the tonal center, as the tonic chord. So by far, the most common borrowed chords you'll come across are between the major scale and a parallel minor scale. And the most common borrowed chords are the minor 4, the flat 7 dominant chord, the flat 6 major chord, and the flat 3 major chord, which all come from the Aeolian mode, a minor 2-5, which comes from the parallel harmonic minor, and a dominant 1 chord, which comes from the Mixolydian mode. So let's take, for example, the song I Got Rhythm. Now it goes like this. Right, so it goes B flat 6 to B flat 7, which is a tonic dominant borrowed chord from the Mixolydian mode. Then it goes a major 4 to a minor 4, which is the minor 4 borrowed chord from the Aeolian mode. And then it goes back into the usual 1-6-2-5. Right, so there are 2 chords that are borrowed from the Mixolydian mode and the Aeolian mode. Now notice that those 2 borrowed chords are surrounded on both sides by chords from the key of B flat major, which is the key that we're in. And it doesn't sound like we've changed key for half a bar. The key change happened for a really short period of time, and the tonal center still sounds like it's B flat, even though we're using chords that aren't in the key of B flat. Therefore, this is not modulation, but a modal interchange. It's a borrowed chord. We've used a chord from a different key for a very short period of time while retaining the same tonal center or root note. So again, I defined modal interchange as using chords from another key for a short period of time while modulation is changing key for a long period of time. Now let's explore this a little bit. So first let's look at the last section of the song, All the Things You Are. Right, so we're in the key of A flat major, and on the second line here we have the chord D flat major 7. That then moves to D flat minor 7, which is the minor 4 chord, which is the borrowed chord from the Aeolian mode. That then moves to C minor 7, which is back in the key of A flat major. It's the 3 chord. So again, that borrowed chord only exists for one bar, is surrounded on both sides by chords from the actual key that we're in, from A flat major, from the diatonic key. And so it doesn't really sound like we've modulated to a completely different key. Because it happens for such a short period of time and it's sandwiched by diatonic chords on both sides, this is just a modal interchange. It's a borrowed chord. The tonal center doesn't sound like it ever changes from the A flat. Now next, let's look at There Will Never Be Another You. So that's in the key of E flat major. And if we look at the third line, we have the chord A flat major, which is the 4 chord, going to D flat 7, which is the flat 7 dominant chord borrowed from the Aeolian mode, and then moving to the E flat major 7. So then we have a 4 flat 7 dominant 1 progression, which is known as a backdoor progression. Now again, that D flat dominant 7 chord, or D flat 9 chord, happens for a short period of time, only one bar, is sandwiched by diatonic chords on either side, and it doesn't really sound like it changes key. The tonal center doesn't sound like it moves. It sounds like it still remains on a E flat. So therefore, again, this is modal interchange, this is not modulation. Next, let's look at the song Ladybird. So this is in the key of C major, and in bars 3 and 4 we have the chords F minor 7 going to B flat 7, and then back to C major 7. So that's a minor 4 chord going to a flat 7 dominant chord, both of which are borrowed from the Aeolian harmony, or the Aeolian mode. And these two chords have created a 2-5, which usually would resolve to the E flat major 7, creating a 2-5-1, but instead they don't resolve and go back to the C, which is the ultimate tonic chord. So because this is a non-resolving 2-5 derived from the Aeolian mode, this can be considered modal interchange, or borrowing chords. And now finally, let's look at Green Dolphin Street. Now section B of that song goes as follows. Right, so again we're in the key of C major. And on the second line there, we have a minor 4 chord going to a flat 7 dominant chord, going to a flat 3 major chord. This then goes back to the G7 and finally to the C major 7. Now those three chords, the minor 4, the flat 7 dominant and the flat 3 major, are all derived from the Aeolian mode. So this could be modal interchange. However, we also have a 2-5-1 in the key of E flat major. So that's a resolving 2-5, 2-5-1. And notice that those three chords last for about 3.5 bars before going back to the G7 and the C major 7, the next bar. So now, is this modulation or is this modal interchange? So even though the song is in the key of C major, and before and after this little section we find ourselves in the key of C major, having a 5-1 in the key of C major, but on the other hand 3.5 bars is quite a long period of time, and we have a resolving 2-5-1 chord progression. So then how long does a modal interchange have to be before it becomes a modulation? And if you'll forgive the cliche, how long is a piece of string? Obviously, there's no answer to this question. It's entirely subjective. Because the answer depends on what you perceive the tonal center or root note to be. If you hear the E flat as the tonal center, then it's a modulation. But if you still hear the C as the tonal center throughout that progression, then it's a modal interchange. So potentially two people listening to the same song could hear slightly different things, could hear the tonal center in different places, and therefore disagree as to whether this is modulation or modal interchange. So the line between modulation and tonicization and modal interchange is very fuzzy. Now also notice that you can borrow the same chord from a number of different modes. For example, you can borrow the F minor 7 from the Phrygian, Aeolian, Locrian, and harmonic minor scales. Now, an F minor 7 is an F minor 7, so it doesn't really matter which mode you borrowed it from. But the answer to the question will depend on the analysis of the whole chord progression. For example, the first 4 bars of Here's That Rainy Day go G major 7, to B flat 7, to E flat major 7, to A flat major 7. Now the A flat major 7 or the flat 2 major 7 chord can be derived from the Locrian or the Phrygian mode. The E flat major 7 or the flat 6 major chord can be derived from the Aeolian or the Phrygian mode. And the B flat, the flat 3 dominant, can be derived from the Phrygian mode. So when you're analyzing this chord progression, you would probably say that those 3 chords, the B flat 7, E flat major 7, and A flat major 7, are all derived from the Phrygian mode, rather than from the Locrian and then the Phrygian and then the Aeolian. And you should also always remember that music comes first and music theory comes second. So a musician writes a particular chord progression that happens to sound good, and then it's up to the theoretician to figure out why it sounds good. And in order to do this, they come up with various ideas and concepts. Now, because of this, there is a number of different ways you can analyze the same chord progression. For example, let's take the song How High the Moon. Now, there's a section in the song that goes as follows. So it's in the key of G, and the chord progression goes G major 7, A minor 7 to D7, B minor 7 to B flat 7, A minor 7 to D7, back to G major 7. Now all of those chords are derived from the key of G major except for B flat 7. So what is B flat 7? Now you could say that it's a passing chord on your way to A minor 7. You could also say that it's a tritone substitute of the secondary dominant chord. So the secondary dominant from the point of view of A minor 7 would be the E7, and a tritone substitute of E7 would be B flat 7. Or you could say that it's a flat 3 dominant 7 chord borrowed from the Phrygian mode, and therefore modal interchange. Right, so all of these are plausible explanations for a single chord in a single chord progression. So if modal interchange is just borrowing a chord from a parallel key, then there's no real reason you need to consign yourself or limit yourself to the modes of the major scale and the harmonic and the melodic minor. Even though these are the most commonly used keys from which chords are borrowed, you could use chords from the modes of the harmonic minor scale or the modes of the melodic minor scale or the diminished scale or the augmented scale or the whole tone scale. Essentially any scale where the root note is still C in our case, where it's the same root note. For example, Take the A Train goes as follows. So that second chord there that lasts for 2 bars is either a D7 sharp 11 or a D7 flat 5, depending on which book or source you're reading it from. Now this chord is actually derived from the Lydian dominant mode, which is the 4th mode of the melodic minor scale, or from the whole tone scale. So technically, the modal interchange that's happening here, or the chord that's being borrowed, is coming from a mode of the melodic minor scale or the whole tone scale. Right, so it's perfectly fine to borrow any chord from any scale as long as the root note or the tonal center stays the same. Cool, so that's it from me. Hopefully that made sense, and hopefully that gave you a good sort of in-depth overview of what modal interchange is and how to use it, and a number of examples as well. As always, feel free to leave any questions or comments, and thanks for watching. See ya!